You've definitely seen its name pop up in the news, right? Almost always when some country is having a massive economic crisis, the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. But what on earth does it actually do? Well, let's get into it.
So, to kick things off, just think about this question for a second. On one hand, the IMF is talked about as this global financial savior, the ultimate lender of last resort. But on the other hand, its critics see it as this unaccountable, shadowy power that forces painful policies on struggling nations. How can it be both of those things at the same time?
All right, here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the IMF's pretty dramatic origin story. Then, we'll break down its power structure. Who's really calling the shots. We'll see it in action, figure out the controversial price of its help, and finally, look at why it's seen as this contested global guardian. To really get the IMF, we've got to go back in time. Back to a moment when the entire global economy was basically in smoking ruins. So the 1930s were a complete disaster. During the Great Depression, every country just looked out for itself, throwing up trade barriers, messing with their currencies. It was a race to the bottom that tanked the whole world's economy. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough, World War II came along and just shattered what was left. So in 1944, delegates from 45 countries got together in a place called Bretton Woods to try and build something new from the ashes.
Now, this is where it gets super interesting. There were two totally different ideas on the table. The UK star economist John Maynard Keynes, he imagined this cooperative fund, almost like a global savings account countries could dip into to keep their people employed during a crisis. But the American guy, Harry Dexter White, he saw it more like a bank, a stern one, whose main job was to make sure any country that borrowed money paid it back. And since America was the last economic superpower standing, guess whose vision won? Yep, White's. And that one decision pretty much set the course for everything the IMF has done since.
And that bank-like vision flows directly into how the IMF is actually governed. You see, to understand why it does what it does, you have to follow the money and see who's in charge.
So the whole thing is built on what's called the quota system. Honestly, you can just think of it like shares in a company. Every member country, all 191 of them, puts money into the pot. How much they put in, their quota, is based on how big their economy is. And here's the kicker. That quota directly determines how many votes they get. It's simple, really. More money in, more power. And this table just lays it out crystal clear. The world's richest countries have the most say. The United States is in a totally different league. And then you have Japan, China, Germany, France, and the UK. And this, as you can imagine, is a huge source of tension. This chart really drives the point home. The US by itself controls about 16.5% of the votes. Now that might not sound like a majority, but the biggest decisions require an 85% supermajority to pass. You do the math. That gives the US an effective veto. And when you lump in their G7 allies, they control this massive chunk of the voting power, which leaves, well, the rest of the world with a much smaller voice.
Okay, so with all that money and all that power, what does the IMF actually do on a day-to-day basis? Well, let's go back to that financial firefighter idea.
Its job really breaks down into three big things. First, it does surveillance, which is just a fancy way of saying it keeps an eye on every country's economy to try and spot trouble before it starts. Then there's technical assistance, offering advice and training. But the one it's really famous for, the most powerful tool it has, is lending. We're talking huge loans to countries that are on the verge of going bust.
And this is the core firefighter part. When a country is in a balance of payments crisis, which basically means they're about to run out of foreign money to pay for imports or pay back their debts, and nobody else on earth will lend them a dime, the IMF steps in. The goal is to prevent one country's crisis from spreading and setting the entire global economy on fire.
But, and this is a huge but, this help does not come for free. And I don't just mean interest payments. This is where we get into the single most controversial thing about the IMF. The strings that are always attached to its loans.
The official term is conditionality, and the policies are often called structural adjustment programs. In plain English, the IMF basically says, okay, here's a few $billion to save you, but in return, you're going to completely overhaul your economy, and you're going to do it our way.
So what does their way look like? Well, it's a pretty standard playbook, often called the Washington Consensus. We're talking about deep, painful cuts to public spending. That's austerity. It usually means selling off state-owned companies, opening up your markets to foreign competition, and getting rid of subsidies that keep things like food and fuel affordable for your citizens.
Now, the IMF says these conditions are absolutely necessary. They argue it's the only way to make sure the country can actually pay back the loan and get its economy on a stable footing. But the critics, they fire back that this is a shocking violation of a country's sovereignty, and that these policies almost always end up hurting the poorest and most vulnerable people the most.
And this quote from Joseph Stiglitz, this guy was a Nobel Prize winner and the former chief economist of the World Bank, a total insider. It just captures that criticism perfectly. He's saying these decisions are made from thousands of miles away by people who have no idea of the real devastating human cost on the ground.
So you can see how this fierce debate has forged the IMF's very complicated reputation. To some, it's a savior. To others, it's a villain.
The arguments against the IMF tend to be pretty consistent, that it's dominated by Western interests, that it pushes this rigid, one-size-fits-all economic model that completely ignores what's actually happening in a country, that its austerity policies can actually make a recession worse and throw more people into poverty. Critics will point to places like Argentina in the early 2000s, where IMF policies were blamed for making a terrible situation catastrophic.
So, has the IMF listened to any of this? Well, kinda. In 2010, after years and years of pressure, it finally agreed to shift just 6% of its voting power over to rising economic powers like China and India. It was a step, for sure, but for many it was way too little, way too late. The fundamental power dynamic with the US at the top didn't really change.
And that brings us right back to the central dilemma of the IMF. Is it a vital institution that pulls us back from the brink of global financial chaos? Or is it a tool that powerful countries use to enforce their economic will on the rest of the world, making global inequality even worse? The real answer is probably somewhere in that complicated, messy middle.
And that leaves us with this final thought to chew on. In a world where economic power is clearly shifting, where countries like China and India are becoming more and more important, can an institution that was created in 1944 really change enough to stay relevant for a new era? That right there is the multi-trillion-dollar question.